We're back on lecture 6. Last time I tried to explain how different society and religion are in the Netherlands and how it's going to affect the art product of that country. Well, now we're beginning to see the truth of that statement. First, let's look at iconography in general terms. Something you need to know for the test. These are the 5 traditional categories of subject matter, and at the top of the list is history painting. That was the major goal of the most important artists like Rubens and Poussin, even Velázquez. They wanted to do history paintings, and it's based on great literature like the Bible and Greek Roman mythology. At the very bottom of this hierarchy is still life painting, depictions of inanimate objects like an apple or a goblet. However, history painting was dependent upon a certain clientele, like the Pope and royalty, or the aristocracy trying to imitate the taste of royalty. And as I pointed out, those demographics are really absent in the Netherlands. Consequently, you just don't have much history painting up there during the Dutch Baroque. History painting is barred from the scene. And that leaves the other 4 categories. And in many ways, some of those categories are very much underdeveloped outside of the Netherlands. And it was the Dutch Baroque artist that started to cultivate the potential of these relatively neglected categories of subject matter, sometimes totally reinventing them. Let's first look at still life. You know, the least of the subjects that, most artists did not want to be burdened with. The Dutch were phenomenal still life painters. And when we look at still life painting in general, also just the Dutch Baroque, remember that visual cultural heritage that they have from the 15th century Flemish painting, something we just looked at. Naturalism, visual texture, and meticulous detail. We're looking at a detail from a 15th century Flemish painting by Van Eyck. Here is a Dutch still life from the 17th century, the Dutch Baroque, and you can see all of those components, naturalism, visual texture, meticulous detail on this canvas. Yeah, get up a little closer and look at how observed the surfaces are, the naturalism is, the reflections, the reflected light, how meticulously delineated the details are. Look at that olive down there. Absolutely amazing. Beautiful work. Here is a less sumptuous canvas, but still it has the same elements. And what I want to point out here is how it conforms to the Baroque mode of expression. Not a high Baroque application of these traits, but the softer, simpler Baroque style. You have a very painterly presentation of the visual texture. Perceptual color, the artist, his subject is before his eyes, and he's recording what he sees, including the color. Selective clarity, there's not a floodlight, there's dark areas there intentionally, to focus attention on the main elements. Recession is the most evident. Let's look at that closer. You have this recessive diagonal shooting back into the space of the painting. Also, you even have a diagonal indicated by that knife jutting just off the edge of the table. That knife detail is frequently included in Dutch still life paintings. And look at that dish with the fish there. Look at the detail of the fish. The dish extends beyond the tabletop and the tablecloth, which sort of become metaphors for the picture plane. We want to just reach out and grab it. It's like visually extending into our space. Open composition. Where is the middle of the painting? It's right there. And the momentum of the painting, the composition, is fleeing that center. It's going leftward and backward. So it is an open composition. It's not closing in to the center. It's leading our eyes away from it. Here's a more elaborate still life, but the same visual compositional elements are at play. You have a sweeping, diagonal, receding into the space, carrying our eyes and our attention along its path. You also have one of those jutting knives to reiterate recession and projection. And speaking of projection, look at that. Here you have two plates. You're barely balancing on the table, extending into our area beyond the picture plane, seemingly. So indeed, this Dutch still life painting conforms to the Baroque mode of expression, whose purpose is to eliminate barriers between the work of art and our experiencing it. It removes the picture plane from our attention. But there's more to these Dutch still life paintings. The Baroque Dutch still life links up that visual texture, meticulous detail, naturalism that we've been looking at with disguised symbolism. So they bring in both aspects of that cultural heritage that we looked at during the 15th century. Here's a term, vanitas still life. It's a very common subject in still life painting in the Dutch Baroque, vanitas. So what does that mean? The word vanitas is Latin, and it means emptiness. There's a biblical passage, says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So what is this preacher saying? Let's translate that a little more modernly. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And that is what a vanitas still life preaches. A vanitas still life addresses the meaninglessness of earthly life and the transient nature of all earthly possessions and pursuits. In other words, there is a deep moralizing sermon inside of these paintings. And it's dependent upon disguised symbolism. And here's another Latin term, and it's equally important, memento mori. Memento mori literally means remember that you must die. And a memento mori object, like a skull, is a symbol in a work of art that reminds you of your approaching death. So a skull and a long bone that we see in this vanitas still life is easy to pick out as a memento mori object. I mean, it's telling us that, our death is approaching. But there are others in this painting I want you to be aware of. In fact, it's full of them. Where else? Right there, there's a 17th century lamp, and it's just been extinguished. It's telling us that human life is frailty, and we can be extinguished like a frail flame by a draft. We could catch a cold and die. So again, it tells us about our mortality. There we have a 17th century watch with the key down there to wind up. Any reminder of passing time is also a memento mori object. Our life is passing before our eyes. Now, the book there is also interesting. It's a history book, and it's telling us that, yeah, you can sum up all of human existence in books and preserve it for future generations. But the painting here is saying, yeah, but those books too will deteriorate and disappear. I mean, that's a real sense of finality to our existence. All record of our lives will eventually be lost, helping us to focus on the one important matter, and that is our soul, which is the eternal part of our existence. And then lastly, we have this goblet that is inverted. It's turned over, and it's stressing to the viewer that the contents are gone. In other words, the glass is empty. And the empty glass becomes a common reminder of what? Of vanitas. And again, vanitas literally means emptiness. So here, visually, they're telling us the emptiness of these pursuits, of all these earthly concerns of our life. Here's another example, and look at this. A lot of the same features we've already mentioned are present. Even that knife down there on a diagonal. But look at the glass. Yeah, it's empty, it's turned over, but it's broken, and the food is half eaten. It looks as though the banqueteers died in mid-bite and fell to the floor because they were so wrapped up with feeding their appetites, they forgot about their impending death and the immortality of their soul. And that's very much what these paintings are about. And like I said, it is an example of more memento mori and vanitas symbols. And one frequent symbol is food. And there's like food there, and frequently you see prepared food in these vanitas still lifes because it's telling you the moment a fruit is picked, it begins to rot, or the moment food is prepared, it begins to spoil. And that translates into the big lesson. The moment we are born is also the very moment we start to die. And these paintings are meant to be constant, albeit gentle reminders not to get too wrapped up in the meaningless of earthly life and the transient nature of all of these earthly possessions and pursuits that we're surrounded by and tempted by. Here is a still life by Caravaggio, and it's a reminder that the Dutch were not the only ones to paint still lifes in the 17th century. However, Caravaggio's still life and others outside of the Dutch experience did not use disguised symbolism, certainly not to the extent that a Dutch still life is immersed in it. And the reason why, as I've mentioned, these paintings offered moral instructions to the Dutch family. Remember, they don't have traditional religious imagery. They don't have saints. They don't have images of saints. They are Protestant, but they still needed to be surrounded by moral instruction. And it goes back to the Dutch dilemma. The head of the household is very much concerned how he raises his family. And yes, they're surrounded by riches, by opulence, by the prosperity of the Dutch merchant, and that's a bit of a temptation to lose sight of one's moral compass, the moral direction in life. So they place all of these gentle reminders through visual art to keep everything in balance. Yes, you can enjoy beauty and treasures like a precious work of art, but still remember the most important possession you have is your soul, and you should never lose sight of it. All right, Homer, let's take off here.